In the Strait of Hormuz, 3 American destroyers were doing nothing more than transiting international waters when Iranian missiles, drones, and small boats came at them from every direction. Within hours, the United States answered with the largest wave of Tomahawk strikes. This war is seen, aimed squarely at the fortified island command centers Iran has used to threaten this waterway for months, August 4th, 2026. And this is the story of how 3 Iranian-held islands, sitting at the mouth of one of the most valuable shipping choke points on Earth, became ground zero for the U.S. Navy's most concentrated Tomahawk cruise missile campaign since the start of this war. Kish Abu Musa. Names most of the world had never heard before this year, now etched permanently into the history of a conflict that has repeatedly circled back to the same 21-mile stretch of water separating the Persian Gulf from the Gulf of Oman. Let's rebuild exactly how this happened, because the sequence matters. According to U.S. Central Command, Iranian forces launched a coordinated, unprovoked attack. Missiles, drones, and small boats simultaneously against 3 American Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, USS Truxtun, USS Rafael Peralta, and USS Mason, as the ships transited the Strait of Hormuz on a routine maritime security mission. President Trump described the moment with characteristic bravado on social media. Missiles were shot at our destroyers and were easily knocked down. Likewise, drones came and were incinerated while in the air. They dropped ever so beautifully down to the ocean, very much like a butterfly dropping to its grave. Beneath the theatrical language sits a serious fact. American warships, operating in international waters, had just absorbed a multi-domain attack from an adversary nation, and no U.S. assets were hit only because of layered air defense systems doing exactly what they were built to do. CENTCOM's response came fast, and it came heavy. U.S. forces targeted the Iranian military facilities responsible for launching those attacks, hitting what CENTCOM described specifically as missile and drone launch sites, command and control locations, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance nodes. Translate that list carefully, because it tells you exactly what the United States considers Iran's fortified island network to actually be. Not tourist destinations, not fishing communities, but a distributed command architecture. Small pieces of land turned into forward operating bases, capable of directing strikes against commercial and military shipping throughout one of the busiest waterways on the planet. A U.S. official told CNN that the strikes hit multiple locations, including Bandar Abbas and Keshem, and just weeks later, in a follow-up wave that a senior U.S. official described as about twice the size of the previous night's bombardment, CENTCOM confirmed it had successfully completed a heavy wave of strikes against Iran in response to yesterday's attempted missile attacks on U.S. forces. Explosions were reported across Bushehr, Abu Musa, Kish Island, Awaz, and Keshem Island. According to Iran's own press TV, the deputy governor of Hormozgan province confirmed that U.S. forces were specifically attacking areas surrounding Keshem Island, with Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reporting 3 separate explosions heard directly on the island itself. Here's the number that should stop you cold, because it tells you just how sustained this campaign against Iran's island command network has become. CENTCOM confirmed. This was the 13th consecutive night of American strikes against Iranian targets during that specific phase of the war, a tempo of operations that few modern air campaigns have sustained for nearly 2 full weeks running. And the scale of ordnance involved is almost as staggering as the tempo. By early April, the United States had already fired approximately 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles at Iran since the war's opening strikes, roughly a quarter of America's entire estimated 4,000-unit Tomahawk stockpile expended in just 5 weeks of combat. That is not a limited punitive strike campaign. That is an air and naval bombardment operating at a rate current U.S. missile production, roughly 90 Tomahawks manufactured per year, cannot remotely replace in real time. Now consider why these specific islands matter so much strategically, because it explains why the Pentagon keeps returning to them strike after strike. Keshem, the largest island in the Persian Gulf, sits directly astride the Strait of Hormuz, separated from the Iranian mainland by the narrow Clarence Strait. Kish and Abu Musa sit further out into the Gulf itself, positioned to give Iranian forces overlapping fields of observation and, more importantly, overlapping fields of fire across virtually the entire width of the strait that roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply transits every single day. Control the islands, and you control the ability to threaten, harass, or shut down that entire waterway on short notice. That is precisely why Iran has spent years quietly fortifying them, and precisely why American military planners have concluded that as long as those island command centers remain intact, no ceasefire in this war can be considered fully secure. There's a translation exercise worth doing here too, because the language both sides use about these islands reveals the stakes underneath the strikes. When Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters warns that ports, docks, and locations linked to U.S. military activity could be considered legitimate targets. It's signaling that Iran views its island network not as passive territory, but as an active extension of its military infrastructure. Fair game for reciprocal targeting anywhere U.S. forces operate in the region. When American officials describe strikes hitting command and control locations and ISR nodes on those same islands, they're confirming Iran's own framing, just from the opposite side. These islands are military assets first, civilian territory second, and both governments have effectively agreed on that classification even as they disagree about who provoked the latest round of strikes. That mutual agreement on classification, even amid total disagreement over blame, is worth sitting with for a moment because it's rare in modern warfare for adversaries to converge so completely on how a category of target should be understood. Neither Washington nor Tehran disputes that these islands function as military command nodes. The entire argument between them is narrower than that, confined to questions of proportionality, provocation, and sequence. Who fired first, whether the response matched the scale of the initial attack, and whether striking islands with civilian populations living alongside military. Infrastructure crosses a line international law is supposed to protect. That narrower disagreement is exactly the kind of dispute that tends to outlive any single ceasefire, because it was never really about the islands themselves. It's about which side gets to write the justification for the next round of strikes, when this fragile pause inevitably comes under strain again. To understand how 3 American destroyers, ships that together carry a fraction of the firepower of a single aircraft carrier, became the tip of the spear for one of this war's most consequential bombardment campaigns, you need to understand the weapon system quietly doing most of the damage, the Tomahawk land attack missile, and the distributed naval architecture built specifically to fire it from anywhere, at any time, without ever putting a pilot's life at risk. Every Arleigh Burke-class destroyer in the U.S. Navy's fleet carries the Mark 41 vertical launch system, a series of missile silos built directly into the ship's deck that can be loaded with a mix of interceptor missiles for self-defense and Tomahawk, cruise missiles for offensive strike missions. According to documentation released by the Navy during this specific campaign, destroyers operating in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman have been firing a mix of Tomahawk Block 4 tactical missiles and the newer Block 5s, variants depending on mission assignment. Block Arver introduced two-way satellite communications through what the Navy calls its tactical Tomahawk weapons control system, allowing commanders to redirect a missile mid-flight, abort a strike entirely, or have the weapon loiter over a target area while intelligence confirms final strike authorization. That capability matters enormously in a campaign like this one, where targets on islands like Keshem can shift within hours as Iranian forces relocate mobile missile launchers and command vehicles in response to earlier strikes. The Navy has documented this campaign in unusual detail for a conflict this sensitive. Official image releases show USS Delbert D. Black conducting a live Tomahawk launch during operations inside CENTCOM's area of responsibility, while separate photography captures USS Smilius supporting the broader strike campaign with confirmed missile activity of its own. Additional destroyers, USS Spruance, USS Bulkley, and USS John Finn among them, have all contributed strikes to what analysts describe as a distributed lethality model, spreading offensive firepower across a dozen or more individually deployed hulls rather than concentrating it in a single strike group. That distribution matters strategically because it means Iran cannot neutralize America's Tomahawk campaign by threatening any single ship or formation. Sink one destroyer, hypothetically, and a dozen others continue firing from separate positions throughout the Gulf and Arabian Sea. There's a detail from this campaign that deserves particular attention: visual evidence of a black-colored Tomahawk launch from USS Spruance, which analysts have suggested points to the operational use of modified or specialized Tomahawk variants beyond standard configurations. Combined with the deployment of the Navy's ANC Q4 optical dazzling interdictor system aboard destroyers like USS John Finn and USS Spruance, designed specifically to counter unmanned aerial systems and surveillance drones during strike operations, the picture that emerges is a campaign, layering offensive Tomahawk fires with defensive counter-drone technology simultaneously, a recognition that Iran's own drone and small boat swarm tactics, exactly the tactics used in the initial Strait of Hormuz engagement, remain a persistent threat throughout every subsequent strike wave. Now consider the targeting challenge these fortified island command centers actually represent, because it explains why so many separate waves of strikes have been necessary rather than a single decisive blow. Unlike a conventional military base with visible runways, hangars, and barracks, Iran's command infrastructure on islands like Keshem and Abu Musa has been deliberately dispersed and, in many cases, hardened or buried to resist exactly this kind of standoff missile campaign. Iranian forces have had years to study how American Tomahawk campaigns typically unfold, and have adapted by hardening command bunkers, dispersing missile launch sites across wider stretches of terrain, and relocating high-value command and control assets frequently enough that a single night's strike rarely eliminates the full network. That's precisely why this campaign required 13 consecutive nights of strikes rather than one dramatic opening salvo, a war of attrition against buried infrastructure rather than a single knockout blow against an exposed target set. The economics of this specific weapon system add another layer of urgency to the entire campaign. The Tomahawk's Block VB configuration, the newest and most capable variant now entering service, is specifically engineered with what manufacturers describe as a devastating mix of blast, fragmentation, and penetration effects, designed to neutralize exactly the kind of hardened command centers, radar installations, and bunkers, complexes Iran has built into its island fortifications. But each missile takes up to 2 years to manufacture, according to defense industry reporting, due to specialized supply chains, single-source components, and persistent shortages of the solid rocket motors that power the weapon's flight. With roughly a quarter of America's entire Tomahawk stockpile already expended in the war's opening weeks, and annual production numbering only in the dozens rather than the hundreds needed to sustain a campaign at this tempo indefinitely, every strike against these island command centers carries an unspoken cost calculation. How many more of these irreplaceable weapons can Washington afford to fire before the arsenal itself becomes the limiting factor in how long this war can be fought at its current intensity? There's a broader industrial story hiding behind that math, one that rarely makes it into coverage focused purely on the tactical details of any single strike wave. Raytheon, the missile's manufacturer, has reportedly been working to scale Tomahawk production toward more than 1,000 units annually. But defense analysts note that ramp-up will take years rather than months, constrained by the same solid rocket motor bottleneck. Affecting nearly every precision munition in the American arsenal right now, that means the destroyers firing salvos at Keshem and Kish tonight are, in a very real sense, drawing down a finite national resource that took decades to build and cannot be replenished at anywhere close to the rate this specific war is consuming it, a quiet vulnerability sitting underneath every dramatic image of a Mark 41 launch cell lighting up the night sky over the Arabian Sea. So why has Iran continued fortifying and defending these specific islands with such determination, even as strike after strike degrades their command? Start with the raw strategic geography. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran's island holdings sit positioned to give its forces overlapping observation and potential strike coverage across nearly the entire width of that waterway. Every tanker, every container ship, every naval vessel transiting between the Persian Gulf and the open ocean has to pass within range of assets based on or near these islands. That's not an accident of geography Iran happened to inherit. It's the exact reason Tehran has invested so heavily in hardening command. Infrastructure there over the past decade, well before this current war ever began. Losing effective military control of these islands would mean losing Iran's single greatest source of leverage over global energy markets, the ability to threaten, slow, or selectively blockade the passage that roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply depends on daily. There's also a legal and political dimension worth understanding, because it explains why the US and Israel have publicly discussed, then repeatedly backed away from, the idea of physically seizing rather than merely striking these islands. 2 unnamed US officials told the Washington Post back in March that the Department of Defense was actively gearing up for potential raids on Karg Island specifically, through which an estimated 90% of Iran's crude oil exports pass, fueling speculation that this war might eventually escalate into an actual ground operation, aimed at seizing Iranian territory outright. That speculation cooled considerably after the 2 sides signed a memorandum of understanding back in June, though, as this most recent wave of island strikes demonstrates, any pause in fighting throughout this war has consistently proven temporary. A regional analyst quoted by Al Jazeera described himself as very skeptical that the U.S. would actually attempt to seize any of the southern islands, particularly Karg, suggesting that even with dominant naval and air superiority, occupying and holding Iranian territory carries a different order of political and military risk than striking it from standoff range. Iran's own retaliatory framing throughout this campaign has been consistent and pointed. When U.S. strikes hit areas around Keshem and other islands, Iranian officials have repeatedly characterized the damage in terms designed to maximize international sympathy and legal scrutiny, emphasizing civilian infrastructure alongside military targets. Iran's foreign minister previously described one contested strike on a Keshem Island desalination plant, an attack the U.S. and Israel both denied, conducting as a blatant and desperate crime that disrupted drinking water supplies to 30 separate villages, regardless of who was actually responsible. That pattern, framing every strike on these islands in terms of humanitarian consequence rather than purely military calculus, reflects Tehran's understanding that international opinion and potential war crimes, scrutiny under international humanitarian law, represents one of the few forms of leverage it retains against an adversary with overwhelming conventional military superiority. And there's a human cost to this, a campaign that deserves acknowledgement alongside the strategic analysis, because it shapes how this war is remembered on the Iranian side of the ledger, regardless of how precisely American forces claim to be targeting only military infrastructure. Civilian casualties have been reported repeatedly throughout strikes on and around these islands and the broader Hormozgan province, including a residential strike on Keshem that Tasnim News reported killed a couple and their child. At least 2 additional people were injured in a separate strike near Bandar Abbas, according to Iran's official news agency. Whatever the intended precision of a Tomahawk strike against a hardened command bunker, the reality of warfare in military targets, as CENTCOM consistently frames its own operations, still produces exactly the kind of human toll that fuels Iran's retaliatory resolve night after night. That resolve manifests in ways that extend well beyond the islands themselves. Every strike on Keshem or Kish that Iranian state media can credibly link to civilian harm becomes material for a domestic narrative Tehran has leaned on throughout this war. 1. Framing the conflict not as a battle between military forces, but as an assault on ordinary Iranian communities by a foreign power with overwhelming firepower and comparatively little exposure to risk. Whether or not international observers accept that framing at face value, it matters enormously for how long the Iranian public is willing to tolerate a war of attrition against its own coastline, and it helps explain why, even after 13 consecutive nights of bombardment against its most fortified positions, Tehran has shown no public indication of abandoning its claim to these islands or the strategic leverage they represent. Even the passenger economy tied to these islands complicates the picture. Further, reports throughout this campaign have noted that airport operations and passenger ferry services on Kish Island continued largely uninterrupted, even during nights of active strikes nearby, a detail that captures the strange, layered reality of this war. A tourist and duty-free economy operating in parallel with hardened military command infrastructure on the very same small strip of land, civilians going about ordinary commerce within earshot of explosions targeting facilities. Their own government has spent years quietly building into their communities. So where does this leave us, standing here in August, looking back at a campaign that turned 3 small islands in the Persian Gulf into one of the most heavily struck patches of territory in this entire war? Let's put the strategic picture together, because what happened on Keshem, Kish, and Abu Musa tells us something important about how this conflict is actually being fought, and about the limits of even America's most sophisticated standoff strike capability. First, understand that this campaign proves a fundamental truth about modern naval warfare that both sides have now internalized. A handful of destroyers, properly armed and distributed across a theater, can deliver strategic-level firepower without ever requiring a single American service member to set foot on contested ground. 3 ships, transiting international waters, absorbed an unprovoked multi-domain attack and responded with a bombardment campaign sustained across 13 consecutive nights, hitting command centers, radar installations, and ISR nodes across an entire archipelago of fortified Iranian territory. That capability, land attack cruise missiles fired from ships hundreds of miles offshore, represents exactly the kind of power projection American naval doctrine has spent decades building toward, and this war has become its most sustained real-world demonstration. Second, watch the numbers behind America's Tomahawk stockpile in the months ahead, because they may ultimately constrain this campaign more than Iranian air defenses ever could. 850 missiles fired in 5 weeks, roughly a quarter of the estimated national inventory, against annual production numbers in the dozens rather than hundreds. If this war continues generating strike waves at anything close to its historical intensity, the Pentagon will eventually face a mathematical reality no amount of naval superiority can solve on its own. You cannot sustain indefinite bombardment with a weapon that takes up to 2 years to manufacture and replace. That constraint alone may do more to shape the war's eventual endpoint than any single diplomatic breakthrough. Third, consider what Iran has learned and adapted to across 13 consecutive nights of strikes against its most fortified island holdings. Command infrastructure that survives. Repeated Tomahawk waves isn't infrastructure that got lucky. It's infrastructure that's been deliberately hardened, dispersed, and hidden specifically in anticipation of exactly this kind of standoff campaign. Every strike that fails to fully neutralize Iran's command and control network on these islands teaches Tehran's engineers something about American targeting patterns. Information that shapes how the next generation of bunkers gets built and ensures that whatever comes after this current phase of the war will require an even more sustained, even more expensive campaign to achieve the same strategic effect. Fourth, and this is the fact that should stay with you long after this video ends, the Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, has become the single most fought over patch of water in the modern world, not because any nation particularly wants the islands sitting inside it, but because whoever controls the command infrastructure on Keshem, Kish, and Abu Musa effectively controls the ability to threaten a fifth of the planet's daily oil supply. That reality alone guarantees these islands will remain a flashpoint in this war, regardless of how many ceasefire violations, or diplomatic breakthroughs punctuate the months ahead. So here's the uncomfortable truth this entire story leads to. Whether the current fragile pause in strikes holds or collapses, the way so many previous ceasefires in this war already have, the underlying strategic calculus around these fortified island command centers hasn't changed at all. Iran still needs them to project deterrent power across the strait. The United States still considers their command infrastructure a legitimate and recurring military target as long as they continue directing attacks against American ships and international shipping. And the destroyers that fired the opening salvos of this specific campaign remain positioned in the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman tonight, Tomahawks loaded, waiting to see whether diplomacy finally succeeds where 13 consecutive nights of bombardment could not. What happens next depends on whether the current diplomatic track, still fragile, still unresolved on the deeper questions of Iran's nuclear program and regional influence, can produce something more durable than the temporary pauses that have punctuated this war since February. One thing is certain. The fortified command centers on Keshem, Kish, and Abu Musa have already absorbed more sustained American firepower than almost any other patch of territory in this entire conflict, and there's no indication from either side's current posture that this specific island chain has seen the last of it. Zoom out far enough, and this campaign becomes a preview of exactly the kind of warfare smaller, resource-constrained militaries around the world are now studying. Closely, a case study in how a handful of well-armed surface ships operating from international waters can hold an entire strategic archipelago at risk indefinitely, without ever requiring the political and human cost of a ground invasion. Whether that model proves sustainable for as long as Washington needs it to, given the finite Tomahawk stockpiles straining under this exact campaign's demands, may ultimately matter more than any single night's target list in determining how this war around the Strait of Hormuz finally comes to an end. If you want to understand exactly how this war's opening weeks set the stage for a campaign of this scale, go back and watch our full breakdown of the early strikes on Karg Island, linked right here. And if you think these fortified islands can survive many more waves like the one we just covered, let me know in the comments below, because this is a story we are not done telling.